My boss said it like he was doing me a favor. I'm going to need you to get Marcus up to speed. He had his hand on the shoulder of a guy I had never seen before. Mid-20s, button-down shirt, easy smile, laptop bag slung over one shoulder. Marcus, his nephew. I learned that part about 12 seconds after the introduction. It was a Tuesday morning. I hadn't finished my coffee. There was no meeting request, no email, no heads up the day before. Just my boss, Carl, standing at my desk with his nephew in a tone that suggested this was already decided. Marcus would be joining the team in a support capacity, Carl said. He needed to understand the operations workflow, systems, processes, the daily cadence. I was the right person to show him. Carl said this like it was a compliment. I asked how long the training was supposed to take. Carl said a couple weeks, maybe less. Then he said something that took me a moment to register. He needed Marcus to have full system access starting today. Full access. Not view only, not a temporary login. The same level I had, which took me 8 months to get approved. I said that level of access usually required a formal request and IT clearance. Carl said he'd handle it. He already had the credentials ready. He handed Marcus a sticky note with a login and walked away. Marcus sat down at the spare chair next to my desk and put his hands behind his head like he was settling in for something comfortable. I noticed he was wearing the same department lanyard as me, same color, same designation. Before he'd attended a single orientation session. I should say something about this job. I spent 4 years on contracts, different companies, different roles, always 90 days at a time with the same suggestion at the end of every cycle that it might become permanent. It never did. This position was the first time in those 4 years that my name went on a door badge, that I had a manager review at 6 months, that my insurance started on day 1. So when Carl walked away, I smiled at Marcus and asked him where he wanted to start. What I did not tell him was that I kept old exports. Had for years. The numbers between our inventory system and the finance dashboard had never fully matched. Not by a lot, just enough to make me check. So I'd started saving monthly snapshots to a folder on my local drive. Old habit. Seemed like nothing. Marcus looked around the workspace, taking it in. He said he hoped the desk had good luck. I asked what he meant. He nodded at the monitor setup, the cable management, the sticky note workflow system on the left side of my screen. Whoever sits here put some work in, he said. Then he smiled. That afternoon, I opened my calendar to find a new event. HR Introductory Meeting. No description, scheduled for the following Thursday. Carl had said nothing about any HR meeting. I went back to my workflow checklist, the document I'd been refining for 2 years. Every process I touched reduced to a single reference page. I was halfway through updating it when I noticed Marcus's screen. He had pulled it up on his own. He'd been reading it for at least an hour. He'd printed a copy and set it next to his keyboard. I came in on Monday to find my equipment on a folding table against the side wall. Not my desk. That was still there. Marcus was sitting at it. My monitors, my keyboard, my dual arm mount, and the cable setup I'd spent 3 weeks running through the wall chase. All of it was on a folding table with a strip of masking tape across the front. My name written on it in marker, like lost and found. Carl was in his office when I knocked. He told me the team was going through a structural reorganization. He said it with his elbows on the desk and both hands flat, the posture of a person who has rehearsed the conversation. The department needed to optimize around a new workflow model. Marcus would be handling the primary operations queue going forward. I would be shifting to a support and documentation role. I asked when this reorganization had been announced. He said it was still being formalized. I asked where the documentation role was posted. He said it hadn't been posted yet. I asked what my new responsibilities would be. He said it was still being worked out, but in the meantime, he needed me to keep Marcus current on the remaining training modules and finish the transition documentation before Thursday. Thursday was when I had the HR meeting on my calendar. I went back to the folding table. The strip of masking tape was slightly crooked. I sat down and opened my laptop. The table was about 6 inches lower than my desk, and from that position I had a direct line of sight to Marcus at my setup. My monitor configuration, my cable routing, the sticky note system I'd built on the left side of the screen over 8 months. He'd already moved the right monitor 2 inches to the left. I don't know why that was the first thing I noticed, but it was. Marcus had logged 4 hours of system time that morning already. I could see the activity summary in the department dashboard. That was expected. He had access. That was normal. What was not normal was the purchase order queue. 3 entries near the top had total values I didn't recognize. I pulled up my own export from the previous Friday. The numbers didn't match. The variance wasn't large, a few $1,000s across 3 orders, but the entries existed in the system with a completed status, and the approval timestamps were from the Wednesday before 3 days before Marcus had started. I saved a copy of both files, opened a folder on my local drive, and dropped them in, the way I always did when something didn't add up. I ate lunch at the folding table that day. I usually went to the break room. That afternoon, Carl stopped at the folding table and set a spreadsheet printout in front of me. He said finance had flagged a reconciliation error from the previous month. and he needed it cleaned up before Thursday's HR meeting. Clean it up meant correcting the entries in the system. He said if I had questions, I could come find him. He walked away before I could ask any. The spreadsheet Carl gave me had a tab called Corrections Q4 Recon. I opened it that evening at the folding table. Most of it was standard variance accounting. Small rounding errors, a couple of manual overrides flagged by the system that needed a sign-off line. Routine. But near the bottom, there was one entry that was not routine. A credit adjustment for $11,400, applied against 3 purchase orders from October. The description field said Data Entry Correction. The date field was blank. Carl had highlighted the date field in yellow and written Enter as October 14th in the margin. October 14th was 6 weeks ago, before Marcus, before the reorganization, before any of this. If I entered that date, the system would log the correction as a legitimate historical adjustment. The money would be accounted for, the variance would close, and there would be no reason for anyone to look at what had actually happened to those orders. The office had mostly cleared out. Marcus had left early. Carl had let him go at 3, which I knew, because I'd watched him pack up from across the room. The fluorescent light above the folding table flickered the way it did every evening at this hour. One short stutter and then steady. I had been at this company long enough to know that specific flicker. It felt like an odd thing to be registering while looking at a date field someone wanted backdated. Then I opened my local drive and pulled up the October exports I'd been keeping. The 3 orders were in there: received, verified, and closed out, with my approval stamp on each one. The values matched the original purchase orders exactly. There was no $11,400 discrepancy in October. There was no data entry error. The numbers were clean until the week Marcus logged in. I did not touch the date field. I did not enter anything in the corrections tab. I saved a copy of the spreadsheet exactly as Carl had handed it to me. Yellow highlight, handwritten margin note, and dropped it into the same folder as the exports. Then I closed the file. I drove home and made something for dinner I don't remember. At some point, I sat at my kitchen table and tried to decide whether I was certain about what I had just seen. I was. That was the part I kept returning to. Not whether it was happening, but what I was going to do about it. The next morning, Carl stopped by and asked if the spreadsheet was done. I said I'd run into a question on one of the entries and needed to look something up. He said to make sure it was finished before Thursday. He did not ask what the question was. I did not go to Carl about the date. I did not email HR. I did not say anything to anyone. I sat at the folding table and kept working. Part of that was instinct. I've been in enough workplaces to know that the person who raises their hand first is often the person who gets managed out for not being a team player. But the other part was simpler. I wanted to understand how far this went before I did anything about it. The folder on my local drive was already making that easier. By Wednesday afternoon, Finance had sent an email to the department distribution list. Subject: Q4 variance, request for documentation. They had caught the discrepancy through their own reconciliation. Not through me, not through anything I had flagged. They were asking which department lead to contact. Carl's name was on the distribution, so was mine. The HR meeting was Thursday at 2. I expected questions about the reorganization, maybe a formal update on my role change. What I got was a woman named Paula who introduced herself as the regional HR partner and spent 15 minutes explaining that Carl had flagged concerns about my adaptability during a period of team transition. She had a folder. She used phrases like communication challenges and resistance to structural change. She spoke calmly and professionally, the way HR people do when they are reading from a script they did not write. When I asked what specific incidents she was referring to, she mentioned that I had not been cooperative in completing the transition documentation on schedule. The transition documentation Carl had given me 4 days ago, that Carl had never formally assigned, that I had been completing in addition to training Marcus. I said that. Paula wrote something down. Then she said Carl had noted I seemed tense around the new team member, which could be affecting department culture. I asked how that had been assessed. She said Carl had observed it directly. I stopped asking questions after that. On the way back from the HR office, I passed Marcus in the hallway. He was talking to 2 people from purchasing, laughing, easy and familiar, like he'd been there for years. One of them, a guy named Drew who'd eaten lunch with me almost every Tuesday for 2 years, looked up when he saw me and gave me a small nod, then looked back at Marcus. Nobody said anything to me. That happened twice more that week. Colleagues I had regular working relationships with started treating our interactions like something to get through quickly. The small talk at the printer stopped. The hallway conversations shortened to a word, then a nod, then nothing. It happens gradually enough that you almost don't notice it. Then one day you look up and realize the dynamic shifted weeks ago. Paula emailed me Friday morning. She needed the process documentation I used as part of my daily workflow, templates, checklists, any archived reference files. She called it knowledge transfer documentation. She needed it by end of day. That was my workflow checklist, the same one Marcus had it already printed. I sent the checklist. I did not send the export folder. Carl stopped by the folding table that afternoon. He had a particular way of standing when he wanted something to land. Weight forward, voice just low enough. He said he hoped I wasn't making this into something it didn't need to be. Think about your reputation before you turn this into something bigger. He let that sit for a moment, then said he'd appreciate it if we could just get the spreadsheet finished. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. I had drafted an email to Paula 3 different times. The third version was one sentence. I'll have the spreadsheet completed by morning. My cursor sat on send for a while. The folder was right there on the desktop. Exports, log screenshots, Carl's handwriting on a printed page. I closed the laptop without sending anything. I am not going to pretend I was certain. I wasn't. I had a job disappearing in front of me and a paper trail I had no idea if anyone would ever actually look at. What I had was a correction that had no legitimate explanation and a boss who had made a request on paper instead of in writing, and the specific discomfort of those two things together. That was it. That night, that was the entire basis on which I decided not to fold. That was on a Friday. By Monday, finance had put a number on it. $48,000? $48,000 is the kind of number that stops a conversation. The finance team had run their reconciliation against the prior quarter's inventory transfer records and found a gap they couldn't close. The transfers in question had all been processed through our department. The discrepancy landed in Carl's inbox Monday morning, and Carl forwarded it to the team with one line. Let's make sure we understand what happened during the handoff period. The handoff period. That was what he was calling the 2 weeks between Marcus's arrival and the completion of my transition documentation. My name was on every approval in that period. The transfers had gone through my access credentials, my department queue, my sign-off fields. Because Marcus had been using my workflow until his own credentialing was finalized, I knew what I had approved. I had the exports to prove it. The transfers in my records totaled $31,200. The gap was $48,000. The difference, $16,800, was not in anything I had touched. Carl asked to meet Tuesday afternoon. When I sat down, he leaned back and said he needed to understand if I had missed something during the handoff. His tone was careful, measured. He did not sound surprised. A person who hears about $48,000 missing from their department for the first time usually sounds at least a little surprised. I said I hadn't missed anything. I said I had records of every transfer I'd approved. He nodded slowly and said that would be helpful, that I should compile everything and get it to him. He said the company would need to do an internal review and that in the meantime, it was important for everyone to be cooperative. Cooperative. That evening, I checked the system logs directly, not through the department dashboard, through the back-end audit trail that IT maintained and that most people didn't know how to access. The logs showed 2 things. First, there were 7 transfer entries with my credential stamps from dates when I had been working remote and had not opened a session in the department system at all. Second, Marcus's account had been granted elevated permissions on his 3rd day, a week before that access level was supposed to be approved through the standard process. The permissions had been authorized directly by Carl. I saved screenshots of both log pages and added them to the folder. The next morning, I was at the printer when someone came up behind me. I turned around. It was a guy from financial reporting named James. Quiet, mid-30s, the kind of person who seemed to always be listening without being the one talking. He had been at the company about as long as I had. We had never had a real conversation. He glanced at the printer, then at me. Do you still have your exports from before the desk move? His name was James Okafor. 6 years in financial reporting, 3 floors down, same building. I had seen him at quarterly all hands, once at the coffee station, once in the elevator. We had never exchanged more than a nod. He asked me to meet him at the parking garage on my lunch break. 3rd level, stairwell side. It felt like a lot, but I went. He handed me his phone. On the screen was an email thread, 14 messages, internal, between Carl and someone in corporate operations named Redmond. The thread went back 8 weeks. In the 6th message, Carl had requested that James's team approve a series of manual override entries for what he described as a reconciliation of legacy data. Standard housekeeping, he called it. Redmond had signed off. The override entries were for the same purchase orders that now had a $48,000 gap attached to them. James scrolled to the bottom of the thread. The final message was from Carl, sent 4 days after Marcus had started. It thanked Redmond for the approvals and said the transition process was going smoothly. I asked James how he had this. He said he'd been in the CC line on one of the early messages and had kept the thread when the override requests started coming in faster than he expected. He said the amounts didn't add up to anything standard. He'd been watching quietly for weeks because he wasn't sure what he was looking at. He asked again if I had the exports from before Marcus arrived. I said yes. He nodded. He said the timestamps on the overrides didn't line up with my access history. entry. He'd pulled the audit summary through his own reporting access. Actions were stamped under my credentials during Windows when my session showed as inactive. He said he didn't know exactly what that meant, but he thought I should know. Then he said something I hadn't fully put together yet. He said the override approvals weren't just covering a discrepancy, they were creating one. The entries were structured to look like rounding corrections, but the net effect across all three orders was a debit to the department's reconciliation account, the kind of gap that needs someone responsible for it. I stood in the stairwell and walked through the timeline, the nephew who arrived with credentials already prepared. The desk moved before any formal announcement. The spreadsheet with a handwritten date in the margin and a request made on paper, not in writing. The HR meeting on my calendar before Carl had told me anything was changing. The transfer entries stamped with my credentials on days I hadn't logged in. This was never about replacing me because I was easy to replace. This was about replacing me because they needed someone whose name was already on the approvals. Paula from HR emailed me Thursday morning. She needed me to come in that afternoon to sign a statement as part of the internal review process. The email was professional, brief, and phrased as a formality. Just to make sure your account of events is documented accurately, I confirmed and spent the time between then and 2 o'clock making paper copies of everything in my folder, exports, log screenshots, the spreadsheet with Carl's handwritten margin note, and the email thread James had forwarded to my personal address the day before. The document Paula gave me was 3 pages. She called it a voluntary incident disclosure statement. I read it once, then again. The first 2 pages were factual, dates, my role, a summary of the reorganization. Standard. The third page described the $48,000 variance and characterized it as the result of an incomplete transition process. Followed by this: in my role as the departing operations lead, I acknowledge that the handoff documentation and system records under my oversight during the transition period were insufficient to prevent the identified discrepancy. Departing operations lead. There was no mention of the manual overrides, no mention of the timestamps, no mention of Marcus's elevated permissions being approved before his 3rd day was over. The document described a gap and placed me at the center of it without naming anything that had actually caused it. I put the statement down and asked Paula for the full investigation timeline, what evidence had been reviewed, who had been interviewed, and the expected resolution date. She said she didn't have that information at her level, and that the statement was just the first step. I said I needed the timeline in writing before I could sign anything. I said I had documentation related to the discrepancy that had not been referenced in the statement, and I wanted to confirm it would be included in the review. Paula wrote something in her folder. She said she would pass that along. She gave me until end of business to sign and return the document. Carl found me at the folding table 20 minutes later. He didn't sit down. He stood with his hands in his pockets and said, "Signing now would make this easier for everyone." He said the company understood these transitions could be complicated and there would be no hard feelings. "Just a formality," he said. "Get it done today and we can all move on." I looked at the document on my desk. I looked at Carl, then I picked up my phone, opened the voice memo app, and set it face down on the table. I said, "I'm not going to sign this today. I'm going to ask in writing what the investigation timeline is and what materials have been reviewed. If that request is answered and I'm satisfied the process is complete, I'll reconsider." Carl looked at the phone. He said, "You're making a mistake." He stood there a second longer than I expected. What was on his face wasn't anger. It was something closer to patience, like he'd been through a version of this before and already knew which way it went. He almost seemed sorry for me, which was the worst possible version of it, because it meant he still thought it was going to work. He left. I emailed Paula from my personal account. Formal written request for the investigation timeline, the documentation reviewed, and the list of people interviewed. Carbon copied to my own drive. Then I put the statement in my bag and went back to work. Paula did not respond to my email. Carl did, on Friday afternoon, to my work address. He copied HR. The email said that after a thorough review, the company had determined the Q4 discrepancy was the result of a breakdown in the transition documentation process under my oversight. It said the company appreciated my service, but had concluded my role was no longer aligned with the department's needs. It said there would be a meeting Monday morning to discuss next steps. Monday morning meant a weekend to sit with it. The meeting was in a conference room I had never used. 2nd floor, glass walls. The kind of room reserved for things that needed a witness. Carl was there, Paula was there, and a woman I had never met who introduced herself as the regional operations director. Her name was Linda. She had a notepad but didn't open it. Carl opened the meeting. He said the company had completed its review and the findings were clear. He said the variance had occurred during a period of transition that I had been responsible for managing. He said every member of the team who had been consulted, he used the phrase, "everyone agrees with me," had confirmed that the handoff process had not met the department's documentation standards. Paula kept her hands flat on the table. Linda wrote one thing on her notepad and set down her pen. Carl slid a folder across the table. Inside was a severance agreement, 1 month's salary, a letter of reference from Carl, and a non-disparagement clause that ran for 2 years. The clause specifically prohibited me from making statements, public or private, that could reflect negatively on the company, its employees, or its operations. Marcus was described in the folder as the incoming operations analyst, not a trainee, not temporary, incoming. I picked up the folder and read it. The reference letter Carl had drafted said I was a dedicated employee whose role evolved as the company's needs changed. It said nothing about my tenure, nothing specific about my performance record, nothing a hiring manager could use. It was the kind of letter you write for someone you want to make disappear quietly. I set the folder down. I said I had not received a response to my written request for the investigation timeline or the list of materials reviewed. I asked whether that request had been addressed. Carl said the investigation had been completed internally. I asked who had been interviewed. He said he wasn't in a position to share that. I said I wasn't going to sign today. Carl said that was fine. He said the offer had a 2-business-day window. He slid a card with his extension across the table. Then he nodded toward the door. There was a security guard I hadn't noticed standing near it, and said they would need my building badge before I left today. Before the meeting was even over, Paula started gathering her papers. Linda had not said a single word. The guard walked me back to the folding table. I am not going to pretend that wasn't humiliating. There is something specific about being escorted through your own workspace, through the systems you built, the processes you documented, the workflow you spent 2 years reducing to a single reference page, that does not soften no matter how prepared you think you are. People looked. Most of them looked away quickly. Marcus was not in the office. He had not been in that morning at all. I had 10 minutes to collect personal items. The guard stood behind me and slightly to the right, which is apparently the standard position. I took my laptop bag, the backup drive from the bottom drawer, and the folder, paper copies of everything. I took the mug I'd had since my first contract job 4 years ago, plain white, no writing on it. I left the desk exactly as it was. The guard walked me to the elevator. The elevator opened into the lobby. The lobby doors led out to the side parking lot. At the side entrance, I held my badge to the reader out of habit. One short beep. The light stayed red. The guard reached past me and opened the door manually. He didn't say anything about it. I stood in the parking lot. It was 11:40 in the morning. The asphalt was bright and the air was cold, and I stood there for a moment with my bag on my shoulder and nowhere I needed to be. The guard waited near the door. He had a clipboard. He was not rushing me. Carl had texted while I was packing. The text said the severance window was still open, and he hoped I would take the time to consider it carefully. He included his personal cell number, not his work extension. In my bag was the folder. In my phone's drafts folder was an email I had written 3 nights ago and not sent. It was addressed to 2 people, the company's ethics and compliance line, and a woman named Susan Delhart, the regional controller whose email I had found in the company directory 6 days earlier, after James had explained how far up the override approvals had gone. The email had 12 attachments, 3 months of exports, screenshots of the audit logs with the credential timestamps, the spreadsheet with Carl's handwritten margin note, the email thread with the override approvals, a timeline I'd written myself, dated and sourced. I had read it back 4 times over 3 days. I hadn't sent it because once I did, there was no version of this where I got to control what happened next. Someone else would be running the process. That had felt like a reason to wait. I stood in the parking lot and thought about what waiting had actually gotten me. The investigation had been completed without reviewing anything I had submitted. My name had been placed on a statement describing a gap I didn't create. A severance packet was sitting in my bag with a clause that would seal my silence for 2 years. The security guard was still by the door. I took out my phone, opened the drafts folder, read the email one more time, then I hit send. I put the phone in my pocket and walked to my car. I heard back in 4 hours. The compliance line acknowledged receipt, assigned a case number, and said someone would contact me within 3 business days. That was it. No indication of scale, no preview of what came next. I went home, made food, and waited. The call came Tuesday afternoon. A compliance officer named Patricia, internal audit, not HR, asked me to walk through the timeline. I did. I started from the morning Carl introduced Marcus and went forward in order. The credentials handed over before any IT clearance, the desk moved before any formal announcement, the purchase orders that didn't match my exports, the spreadsheet with the handwritten date in the margin, the transfer entries stamped under my credentials on days I hadn't opened a session, the statement I hadn't signed. I went through it, item by item. She asked clarifying questions at each step. She did not sound skeptical. She sounded like someone writing things down carefully. At the end, she said she'd need the attachments I had referenced. I had already sent them. She confirmed receipt. Then she asked if I was familiar with James Aquifer's name in the context of this matter. I said yes. She said he had contacted the compliance line independently the day before I had. He had submitted the email thread with the override approvals before I had said a word to anyone. I sat with that for a moment after the call ended. He had been watching those override requests for 2 months, sitting on the thread, said. And when I sent my email Monday afternoon, he had already sent his Sunday evening. That's the thing about the quiet people who seem to just be listening. Sometimes they've already decided. She said the case was now under formal review and asked that I not contact anyone at the company directly while the investigation was active. I said I understood. She gave me her direct line. The call ended. Carl called me Wednesday morning. His voice had the same measured quality as always, but something underneath it was different, just slightly, just enough to notice. He said he hoped I would reconsider the severance offer. I said I had been advised not to discuss the matter while the review was active. He said that was fine. That was the last time he called. 5 days later, Patricia emailed. Both Carl's account and Marcus's account had been suspended pending audit. She said to expect contact from the regional operations director. I was at the coffee shop 2 blocks from my apartment when Linda called. The same woman who had sat in the conference room 8 days earlier and not said a single word. She opened with, "I want to start by apologizing to you directly." I put down my cup. She said the review had confirmed that the access entries and credential stamps attributed to my account during the relevant period had been generated without my authorization. She said the manual override approvals had been traced to Carl's chain. She said Carl's employment had been terminated for falsifying records and for approving unauthorized system access. She said Marcus had been removed before his probationary period was complete. She delivered all of this in the careful, reviewed language of someone reading from findings, but there was something underneath the language that wasn't performative. She had sat in that conference room and watched it happen and said nothing, and now she was on the phone telling me it had been wrong. I don't know what she knew before Monday. I never asked. She offered a settlement, the specific figure I'm choosing not to post. But it was more than the severance, and it was not conditioned on silence. The non-disparagement clause was gone entirely. Along with it came a corrected employment record and a formal reference from Susan Delhart, the regional controller, who had never met me until the compliance call, a letter that described my actual tenure and actual performance, something a hiring manager could use. James was listed in the final audit summary as a contributing witness. He's still at the company as far as I know. We've talked twice since this ended, once when it was over and once a few months later when he reached out to say the new operations team was running cleaner than it had in years. I don't have a good way to account for the kind of person who watches something quietly for 2 months and then does the right thing on a Sunday evening without telling anyone. I'm glad he exists. I don't think much about Marcus. What I think about is the specific moment when the exports turned out to matter. Not because I had planned for them to. I kept them because the numbers between systems had never fully matched, and that gap was worth tracking. 4 years on contracts teaches you that nothing you build in someone else's system belongs to you, so you keep your own record of the work that proves you were there. I didn't keep those files because I knew I'd need them. I kept them because I always had. The habit just was. When people ask what I would have done differently, I don't have an answer. The thing that saved me wasn't a strategy. It was a folder I'd been adding to for years without knowing why. I was never hard to replace because I thought I was irreplaceable. I was hard to replace because I was the only person keeping the mess legible. If that kind of story stays with you, there's more where this came from. Subscribe and you'll get the next one.